All right, Matthew, thank you so much for taking the time out of what I know is a very busy week to come and talk to us about fires in the night.
Thank you so much for having me, Van, and for agreeing to moderate. And thank you to New America for hosting this. They've been such incredible support of the project. I'm so happy to be here.
Well, first off, can you just tell us a little bit more about the book?
Sure. The book is Fires in the Night, The Earth Liberation Front, the FBI, and a Secret History of Eco-Sabotage. It is the story of the Earth Liberation Front, or the ELF, which was a mysterious band of environmental activists who, in the 1990s and 2000s, set a series of fires of targets of industrial pollution and animal killing, such as slaughterhouses, SUV dealerships, logging companies, as a way of protesting environmental destruction. And they became the FBI's number one domestic terrorist threat, even though they never hurt or killed anyone. So the story is of both the activists as they carried out this series of crimes and the FBI as they tried to catch them. And it involves larger themes about the limits of radical politics and the what happens when conventional politics fails and how do you fill in that gap and how when you're fighting for a righteous cause, how far is too far?
Well, one of the things for everyone who is watching, it's such a propulsive book. It's cinematic in a way, and I imagine it requires quite a bit of in-depth reporting. And I want to know, how did you first come across this story?
So I remember the ELF from when I was a kid. There were these, it became a national news story, this, series of mysterious fires carried out by vigilantes under cover of night. And I remember seeing news reports about them. And then I got the opportunity to revisit the story in 2018 after the ELF disbanded. A number of them actually went on the run and became fugitives. And the FBI spent a number of years trying to pick them up. And one of the ELF fugitives, Joseph Dibby, was arrested in 2018. So it gave me a moment to sort of revisit the ELF after about 20 years had passed. And at that point, we were in a very different context. When the ELF was active, they were, largely kind of dismissed or mocked, or what they were arguing seemed kind of inserious. And 2 decades later, when we're in the midst of the climate catastrophe, when that's part of our lived reality, it made me think that they were actually a little prescient about some things. So it was a moment for me to go back and revisit that. And I was able to reach out to a number of members of the ELF who had done prison time and were now out and had not really talked to journalists about their involvement before. They were actually now willing to revisit it too and share their experiences in the group. So it was an opportunity for me to revisit a moment in history in a different context.
Well, I'm curious. You do mention ELF. They were the number one on the domestic terrorism list. It wasn't all that long ago, like if we think about, the Weather Underground, for example. And yet, there hadn't been a lot of reporters reaching out to this group, as you say. Why do you think that is? Why do you think this chapter, I remember seeing the sort of the alerts or the most wanted like stuff. And why haven't we revisited that yet?
That's a good question. I mean, there's been a lot of revisiting of right-wing militancy, but not so much about militancy on the left. And it's an open question for me about why that is. In the ELF's case, some of it was structural. There was a period they were active for a period of time, but nobody knew who they were, which made them difficult to interview. And then there was a period of time after they disbanded, but before they were caught, which meant that when they were actually arrested, the story wasn't quite as fresh. But it was also a situation where the media had not treated environmental radicalism particularly kindly. There was this kind of uncritical labeling of what they did, which was sabotage, where again, nobody was hurt or killed, as terrorism, specifically eco-terrorism. And I think that made them both a difficult group to interview in that, particularly after 9/11, the idea of interviewing, terrorists was something that was, I think, complicated for a lot of journalists. And it also, for folks in the group, I think it led to a lot of distrust about talking what they were involved in, where they would just be dismissed as terrorists. So it's a great question, but I think it was now when I think the national mood is a little more ELF-ish and where we're beginning to reconsider radical politics with a little more thought. It seemed like an appropriate time to go back and consider their legacy.
I imagine a lot of the folks you reached out to were probably hesitant to speak to reporters. How did you work that? Was it sort of word of mouth from people who did agree? Yeah, it seems like you really got some people who spent some time with you.
Yeah, this began life as a story for the New York Times Magazine. Usually, when you're doing a story for the New York Times Magazine, that's a real asset as far as getting sources to talk with you. It lends some kind of, even if you're a freelancer, it lends some kind of credibility that, you're not going to you're going to be, somewhat accurate. For the ELF, that was not a mark of credibility at all. The New York Times had not treated them particularly kindly in the past. Again, they'd kind of uncritically referred to them as terrorists. So it took a lot of trust building. It took a lot of, in some cases, going out and seeing people and really just sitting over coffee and talking with them for a while before they'd agree to go on the record, before they'd agree to share what had happened. And for people who had done, I think this applies to all cases where if you've been arrested and you've done a lot of prison time for something, it can still be difficult to talk about that for a lot of reasons. It feels really fraught. And in this case, I think doubly so because it was, they've had a poor relationship with the media and they were really punished for what they did. So I think it just took a lot of talking and a lot of letting sources kind of smell you for a while.
Can you tell us just a little bit more about some of the people who show up in the book?
Yeah, it was an interesting cast of characters. I mean, these were all people who were in some ways like very passionate about what they did. They all came out of the either environmental or animal rights movement. So they were all, very sort of ethically principled and very motivated. The book focuses at its center is a guy named Kevin Tubbs. And Kevin had a pretty unconventional background, at least for radical activism. He grew up in a conservative family in Omaha, Nebraska. His dad was in the Marines. And growing up, Kevin actually wanted to be in the Marines too. But he was also like really into punk music and he really loved animals. And he had a lot of dogs in his house when he was growing up. And at some point, he kind of did the math and was like, wait a minute, why do we have dogs in the house, but we also like eat cows? How does that work? Like, wait, why are we allowed to hurt animals? Like, what's going on with that? And he ended up deciding to not go into the Marines and instead became an animal rights activist. And that eventually brought him to Eugene, Oregon, which is the center of the radical environmentalism movement at the time, where he met somebody named Jacob Ferguson. And Jacob Ferguson, totally different guy, like a crust punk, a guy who'd sort of been riding the rails, stealing cars for a few years, had a heroin problem for a while. But Jacob had also was, searching for purpose and had ended up in the same place as Kevin. And they ended up joining forces and helped founding the ELF. And on the law enforcement side, I focused on a few characters. There was John Ferreira, who was this very colorful, very sort of un-FBI-like agent in the Eugene field office who was from Hawaii. He'd wear like Hawaiian shirts, but he was also incredibly hardworking. And just by kind of happenstance, he got thrown on the case and pursued it for a decade with the assistance of Greg Harvey, who was a local detective in the Eugene Police Department, who went undercover actually in the radical environmentalism movement for a number of years. He even went so far as to, like, he put together an activist disguise where he took an old Halloween costume of Jesus with the long wig with a brown hair and sort of dirtied it up a little bit and wore that with a little, wool hat and went to activist parties and rallies and things like that and sort of tried to map out the movement as a way of trying to figure out who might be in the ELF. So it was a story that allowed for, on one hand, there was this very sort of, heavy philosophical issue, but it was also ended up being quite colorful.
I felt like, and pardon the pun, reading, I felt like I was watching the movie Heat for a moment. Yeah, there was this real sort of parallel between the ELF folks and the law enforcement on the other side.
I like that movie for a lot of reasons, as I think does everybody, but it's also, I mean, it's something that it's a movie that means morally neutral and gives, equal weight to police and criminals and tries to sympathize with where they're at and not judge either side overly harshly. And I thought about that movie a little bit. Michael Mann's work all has this kind of like, he's very much a journalist. He does a lot of research before he does those things and talks with people. But it also is a movie with scope. And this was when writing the ELF book, I think one of the things that I liked about the story was that takes place over 10 years and it brings in a lot. It brings in, the anti-globalization protests of the 90s. It brings in the post 9/11 security state. It brings in, the sort of the history of environmentalism in the latter half of the 20th century. And I appreciate an opportunity to be able to sort of tell this on one hand, kind of like cops and robbers story, while also giving it some, I hope some heft, or using it as a vehicle to address a lot of things that we're still dealing with today.
Now, all these folks that you mentioned who you follow, who are ultimately part of the ELF, they don't obviously start there. They start in the radical, environmental movement in Eugene, but that movement is primarily focused on maybe some monkey wrenching, as they called it. And they did a lot of actions to block logging. So, how do they go from that to a much more actively going and targeting, the faces of sort of industrialized pollution and animal slaughter?
It's a great question. I should give a little bit of like a pocket history of the environmental movement. So environmentalism rose in the 1950s and 60s as a response to basically industrialization. There was this kind of growing awareness that for all our economic prosperity, there were some real drawbacks in the form of pollution, in the form of destruction of nature. And the movement kind of codified in the late 60s. And there was all this legislation that went through that were, still in use today. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, these designed to protect both us and the natural world. And this was a really like a bipartisan thing. Like, I mean, the Clean Air Act, I think passed, I want to say unanimously through Congress. I mean, just unheard of today. At that point, there was a little bit of an industry pushback, and the issue became deeply partisan as we know it today. The Republican Party did a full 180, and it became pollution and environmental destruction became an issue of consumer choice. It was no longer something that the federal government was supposed to be involved in. But at the same time, environmentalism as a movement was kind of corporatizing, was getting larger. There were these big groups like the Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, and they were really trying to kind of, particularly in the 80s, like working within the limits of what was possible. They were trying to, make consensus across the aisle, doing all the things that big NGOs are supposed to do in DC. And this frustrated a lot of radical activists, particularly grassroots activists in the environmental movement, no end. So there was kind of a split within the movement where a number of them formed what became known non-pejoratively as radical environmentalism, where they decided to have both this kind of extremity in terms of ideology, pushing for much more stricter regulations for much more land to be saved, and also an extremity of tactics, where they would begin to do, as you said, monkey wrenching, sort of small scale sabotage, and where they'd, spike trees, where they disable bulldozers, things like that. Sabotage was always controversial within the movement, but it was it was definitely a part of it. But that seemed to not have the effect that people wanted. And by the 90s, with the Clinton administration, which was, pro-environment, but also very pro-corporate, a number of activists got frustrated again. And for members of the ELF, they felt that things needed to be kicked up a notch. That if what they were doing with these kind of theatrical, prankish forms of sabotage, they really needed to do something more. And that meant arson. That meant really destroying the infrastructure of industrial capital or fossil fuel or things that were responsible for destroying the earth. And I don't think anybody set out knowing it was going to work, but it came out of a point, I think, of desperation and frustration. And it seemed like to them the best tactic that they had available at that particular moment.
Uh, I seem to be full of movie references at the moment, but
Please, I certainly thought about screenplay structure while I was writing this, so they're very welcome.
but also I'm hearing, as the Jaws music is in the background for the whole book, there's climate change. And there's sort of like, this sea change of awareness and the scope of the problem that is happening, at the exact maybe the nadir of the ELF sort of like of their movement and as they begin to actually get sniffed out by the law. Do you think, um, the pejorative way the media saw them and radical environmentalism had anything to do with the fact that climate change, global warming, took so long to sort of become part of the national conversation?
Well, I mean, the ELF was very aware of global warming. I mean, so the House organ for the radical environmental movement was the Earth First newsletter, Earth First journal, and the Earth First was sort of the main organization, usually based in Arizona in the Pacific Northwest. That to the degree that the radical environmentalist movement was organized, it was organized around Earth First. And I would go back and I read old issues of it. Starting in the 80s, they're talking about global warming. But it took a long time for the effects, as we're all seeing today, to become visible. But it was something that was, and it was not quite the issue as it is today in the 90s. But I think that what we're seeing now, I think bears out some of what the ELF was arguing. And their essential argument was we are not doing enough quick enough to prevent ecological catastrophe. And while the issues that they were concerned about were a little different than the ones we're concerned about today, I don't think many people would disagree with that at this point. So I think they were quicker to come to that feeling than a lot of us are right now.
Well, that's also a thing that I found interesting. The modern environmental movement, the legacy organizations like Sierra Club that you mentioned, they have become so, even in embracing climate change, um, their focus is so technocratic and scientific now. ELF, was part of this movement where there were people trying to, commune with nature in a real way. They were concerned about the welfare of animals, and about the maybe spiritual dimension or the moral dimension of deforestation, for example. I guess the question that I have is did we lose that with ELF?
Yeah, and there was I think we definitely lost it in the past 20, 30 years. I mean, as you say, I mean, radical environmentalism was grounded in something very ambitious and very, very almost utopian. This idea that we could cohabitate with nature and that their frame of thinking was not about what is politically possible, but what do we want? It would be, there was somebody, one historian phrased it as, at the same time that people in DC were thinking about, where do we cite toxic emissions? How many cars, should we allow, or what should be the emission limits for tailpipes? The radical environmentalists were thinking like, do we need cars? Do we need these hulking power plants, spewing carcinogens? How do we form a society that doesn't do that? And I think that we are much more wedded to the realm of the possible right now. And I think you're absolutely right that we see that in larger environmental groups. I still think are very much embedded in a legislative infrastructure that really prevents the kind of grandiose thinking that fueled radical environmentalism. There was a very thoughtful article in The Atlantic about this recently, about the how much of environmentalism has been taken over by climate and a thinking about specifically about climate and a sort of technocratic thinking about climate, as opposed to a much more kind of romantic understanding of the natural world, which fueled environmentalism from its earliest days around conservation in the early 20th century. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think it's something that I would not be surprised if some future generations, given the kind of like incipient Ludditism that you're seeing, might go back to that at some point.
Yeah, that was also another element of it that fascinated me is the rejection of, sort of technology in a real way.
Mhm.
I'm curious, one of the reasons that I felt that, ELF didn't have much to do with me was it was a very, sort of a sector of the country where that's where people that's what they did. And it was mostly white. But they did take a lot of their sort of historical, their footing and tactics from these groups that were, radically left that had been involved in civil rights. Were there, tensions in the movement over this aspect?
Absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right too, that they were a lot of the folks in the radical environmentalism movement. And I should say that the ELF also had a strong thread of anarchism running through it. Some of the members were self-identified anarchists, but radical environmentalism had not been sort of overtly anti-capitalist in the way that anarchism was. And the ELF was very much that. So in addition to a kind of like change in tactics, there was also a change in ideological premises that as opposed to radical environmentalism. That was something that was very different. But yeah, there were always tensions in the movement around what was a proper historical example and where you wanted to select from, even in the civil rights movement. I mean, they were a lot of the ELF were very well read. A lot of them had read both about, movement histories, but also histories of FBI infiltration. It was part of the reason they didn't get caught for 10 years, that they were very aware of how the FBI pursued these kinds of groups. But it's a great question. I mean, there's a Douglas McAdam, a professor at Stanford, writes about radical flank effects. And radical flank effects are this idea that for any political movement, it's very helpful to have a extremist flank that pushes in the movement into uncomfortable places, both tactically and ideologically. And that's because it makes the movement, the rest of it, by comparison, seem very reasonable. It also is a helpful cudgel. It can give a political movement kind of fangs. So I think that was something when looking back at the civil rights movement, I think a number of activists in environmentalism thought about what parts of that can we incorporate? Which parts of it do we want to emulate? And some went for a more militant version, and some were focused much more on a were more into civil disobedience, let's say.
Yeah, that was the fact that the Sierra Club people would, outwardly reject a lot of the more radical actions, but internally say, okay, now we can get closer to what we
It,
want.
it was a big deal 10 years ago when the Sierra Club for the first time said, "Okay, we're trying civil disobedience. We haven't done this before, but we're gonna do that." I mean, after, decades of this going, they had always said, we're keeping it within the system. And then they took this very small step to say, "Okay, if you want to chain yourself to something, we're okay with that." And that you're right, that was a big moment for them.
When I first met you, you were working on this book. And the question I always like to ask people who have now gone through the eye and they are, they've published a thing. What, what have you learned? What surprised you in your reporting?
It's a great question. I think what the thing that I learned that I had not really been conscious of, where I think I thought about both law enforcement and political movements in very abstract terms as sort of entities with their own incentive structure that sort of moved, according to how they had their own kind of logic that just went forward. What I learned in writing this was how much the decision making of these institutions sort of come both on the activist side and on the law enforcement side comes down to individual personalities or comes down to the people who are in them. And as somebody said when I was writing this was, social and political movements are really at the end of the day a set of relationships. And the movement can rise and fall on how those relationships work. So both for the ELF side, I mean, the ELF began to make some real mistakes, and this came in part because they began to bring in people who weren't as experienced. They were passionate about some things, but they may not have known what they were doing. And it created a lot of problems, and it led to the groups in part to their dissolution. On the FBI side, the FBI's decision to go after radical environmentalists or to consider them eco-terrorists came down to the decision of a number of individual people within the Bureau. It was not something that was, dictated from on high. And the actual investigation to the ELF was led by, John Ferreira, this guy who, both responding to institutional dictates, but also just because he wanted to investigate it, pushed the investigation for a full decade. I mean, well after the group had disbanded. So it was a reminder to me that, as much as we may think of these as in the abstract, it's these every entity like this is very, very personal and very human and subject to the kind of frailties that every human is. So that was a helpful reminder for me as I was writing this to both think about it in big structural terms and also at a different, more granular level.
When you mention, that this is driven by relationships, the person that comes to mind to me is Avalon. Um, can you talk to us a little bit more about Avalon?
A fascinating character.
Yeah.
Yeah, Avalon, a guy, his real name was William Rogers, but his name was within the movement was Avalon, and he was kind of the intellectual force behind the ELF. He was a guy who had been a teacher in Arizona, and he used to print out these like readers. They'd just make himself. That would be this compilation of things that he'd read, whether it be from anarchism, whether it would be Walt Whitman, whether it would be Thoreau, whether it be Calvin Hobbes, and he'd just like sell them out of the back of his van. And it was uh, at one point he took a kind of militant turn. He was initially very much against any kind of violence, any kind of he was I think in his own life he was a very sort of pacific person. He was the kind of guy who, like, when a fly would fly into his van, he'd be very careful to catch it without hurting it and release it. He didn't even like kind of keeping house plants because they had this idea that plants deserve a life in the wild. But he was also somebody who became very hard-edged. He became very frustrated by his failure to protect the natural world and decided that he really needed to that at first arson and then later, he began to discuss other kinds of violence. At one point, he was sort of toying around with, if this isn't working either, is this the time that we start getting guns and start assassinating oil company CEOs? And that never came to pass. The rest of the ELF was very against this. But he was a really interesting figure as far as seeing somebody who's very passionate about this subject and go through this whole kind of ideological journey about how do you actually, if you feel strongly about something, and you feel what you're doing is moral, how do you pursue that? And what's the right way of doing that?
Okay, so you mentioned this earlier. In the book, one of the really seismic things that happens is 9/11. And, it really dramatically changes the law enforcement and the surveillance landscapes in ways that I don't even think I fully appreciated until I
I don't
started.
think I don't think any of us have fully appreciated even 20 years on. I mean, go on, excuse me.
No, I was just going to ask, like, what is there anything there that you had didn't know going in or surprised you?
I mean, well, I had to read a number of histories of the FBI while writing this. And one of the things I really wanted to understand was the FBI decided after 9/11, out of all the things that were happening in the United States, all the kind of violent threats, why did they pick out the ELF? Again, a group that had never hurt or injured anybody, that had, focused on property, not people. Why did they become such a threat to the FBI? And this required sort of learning a little bit about how the organization worked. One of the things that was interesting was, I mean, the FBI historically was kind of a traditional reactive law enforcement agency. When a crime happens, the FBI goes and investigates it and tries to catch who did it. After 9/11, all of that changed. The FBI became both, it was reorganized from focusing on more traditional crimes like, robbery or fraud or something like that to counterterrorism, The whole organization became about counterterrorism. And also, instead of being a reactive organization, they now had to be proactive. It was their goal to prevent terrorism before it happened. And that changed the whole mindset of the Bureau. And one of those things required them to kind of try and predict, like, all right, who will be a threat in the future, even if they aren't now. And radical environmentalism for them was something that they didn't know very well. The Bureau didn't have a ton of experience with it as a movement. And some of the things that the radical environmentalists said about overthrowing the state, about, taking down industry, the FBI took that very seriously. And as when they began to think about after 9/11 with this, incredibly traumatic event where they had manifestly failed to stop something, a number of people in the counterterrorism division told me that their biggest concern was just not getting caught out again. And they had to kind of, even if the radical environmentalists at that point hadn't been violent, they began to imagine that maybe they would be in the future. And that was what really, I think, went into their prioritization of the ELF as a really dangerous threat.
I do want for everyone watching, we will be doing audience questions toward the end, and I want to remind you all if you have a question, you can pop it in the Slido chat box on your screen. Uh, Matthew, this, I've been thinking a lot about, how radical movements, um, how this surveillance apparatus has changed those groups today. And, I think it has, in a sense, done a lot of the job of stopping things like sabotage. But has it changed the rhetoric in those circles?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you're absolutely right first that it has. I mean, in the God-kissed 90s, you could get away with a lot. I mean, there was not as many people watching you. It was harder to track people. It was a prosperous time, but in some ways it felt like, I think, for activists, a little bit more of a optimistic, free time where you could, it was possible to elude the FBI for 10 years, because the panoptic state had just not advanced to the point where it is today. In terms of, obviously, that's much harder now. In terms of rhetoric, I mean, it's been interesting seeing very recently. I was just having a conversation with somebody about data centers, and data centers are a situation where people are furious about it, and all these communities are having these, noisy, polluting industrial infrastructure just sort of move in, and nobody asks them. There's no sort of democratic process behind it, and it places them in a situation where they are not able to push back against this through conventional means. Data centers don't really avail themselves of lawsuits. There's nothing, you can't vote on them. And I've been seeing a lot of sort of ELF-ish rhetoric around it. I mean, would right down to sort of like, just burn these things down. So I think that you can see that in specific political movements to a certain degree, but I think it's much more ambient than that at the moment. I think people are frustrated in a lot of different arenas about a feeling that the system is broken, that you're not able to make change through conventional means. And I think that lends itself to violence. I think that lends itself to militancy. And I think it lends itself to a particular type of vigilantism, where when you're prevented from making change through traditional means, that's what you resort to. So yeah, I think rhetorically, I'm seeing a lot of that right now.
I did think a lot about data centers. That did come to mind when I was reading Fires in the Night, because I think with climate change, it's so diffuse in a lot of conversations, right? There isn't a thing you can go and vent your frustrations out about with climate change. In the same way that this building there that is, doesn't have any people working in it might. And so I was, curious if you've seen, especially as you start, you're going around the country talking about the book, um, any ways that the ELF, its actual legacy, its rhetoric is actively, sort of penetrating the mainstream now.
So I'm off to the Pacific Northwest next week to do a tour in Seattle, Portland, and then Eugene, Oregon, which is where the ELF was centered. And when I've been talking with folks who've been organizing on for bookstores or who are planning on attending that, it's interesting how much the ELF still lives in local memory and how many people are still have very strong feelings about it. And I'm curious to see as talk when I'm out there and I talk with more people, how people are holding it. I think it's a story that's been largely forgotten by the nation at large. At the same, and as part of the reason I wrote the book, is I'm curious to have people revisit this. I think I think it's relevant for a number of different reasons, but I'm very curious to see how people respond to it now, both in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere.
As a, reader of history, and who has read a lot about, especially the Black radical tradition in America, I'm wary of histories that sort of overly romanticize the dynamics within these groups. And I want to ask you, sort of like you do get into the nitty-gritty, the way that violence can become its own justification in a real way. Are you seeing people who are maybe dissatisfied with your treatment of the story?
Sure, there was an excerpt that ran in a the Portland's like independent their weekly the Willamette Week, and one of the federal prosecutors on the ELF case who I tried to interview and declined waded into the comment section, was clearly very upset about the article and that I referred to it as eco-sabotage, not eco-terrorism. And there are a number of people who are, again, I don't like terrorism as a word or as a descriptor. I think it obscures more than it clarifies. I think it's really often just used kind of capriciously to describe acts of militancy that you happen to not like. But in this case, he was very upset that I had said sabotage, not terrorism. And I think that I've heard from some people who've had that similar reaction, where in not using that word to describe what the ELF did, to describe the arsons, I'm letting them off the hook, or I'm not treating it with the seriousness that it deserves, or I'm not uh, there should be an element of moral reprobation in how I talk about it. And that hasn't really, but that's been really interesting. By and large, though, I feel like people have understood that it is a difficult moral question in all cases about when you're fighting for something you believe in, what's okay? What are you allowed to do? When are you allowed to break the law? When are you supposed to break the law? And I think most people are very thoughtful about that and understand it's difficult and nuanced.
Yeah, I was, when I think about, again, things like the weather underground, the primary actions happened so long ago that it's more abstract, right? That the violence, that the different actions, the response, they're so much farther away in public memory that they don't elicit the same sort of strong opinions. But most of the people, the principals in your story are still around.
Yeah, it's wild to have somebody to something that still lives in history, but be able to ask them, how and memory is a funny thing. People can remember things very differently from how they happened, and sometimes I'd have things that would be very firmly documented, and somebody would just who was involved would remember it entirely wrong, not through any kind of mendacity, but just that's how it works sometimes, where things get painted differently in your head. But yeah, it's something where it's in the past, but it's in the recent past, and that's a funny kind of middle distance in which to view things. And I'm very curious about when if people who read the book are reminded of this or learn about it for the first time, what they make of it, and the degree to which they see it as relevant for right now.
Well, what do you hope that your average reader will take away from the book?
I'm more curious to hear what they think of it. I don't have a particular message. Sometimes when I was reporting this, even people who had been in the ELF, kind of would ask me like, "What's the lesson from that you're getting from this? Like, what was, there was an old Peter Guralnick, if you know his work, like he wrote a book about soul singers or soul musicians. And he talked in the prologue about going back and talking with people at a similar, actually, at a sort of similar time frame, about 15 or 20 years after soul had been at its height. And he was going back and trying, and a lot of them were in this moment of really trying to figure out what they'd been a part of. There was a real sort of searching quality to it. And he hit them at the right moment where they were very sort of eager to talk about it and trying to sort of work through it for themselves. And so for me, I mean, a lot of the people I talked to were sort of asking me who had not been a part of this at all, what do we take from this? I never sat down on a firm moral or ethical lesson or something very neat about how to use violence or about what the ELF's legacy was. So I'm very curious to hear what readers make of it. And in some ways, that's kicking the question back at everybody else, but I genuinely am.
No, but that's fascinating. I think the idea, the fact that these people are still trying to find the meaning in this themselves and looking to you as the journalist to do that synthesis. It speaks, I think to the unsettled nature of history.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think everybody is trying to. Um, I think everybody who's involved in something important, it's like any other kind of trauma. It takes a while to work through.
Well, have you, I imagine, I talk to a lot of folks who've done really in-depth reporting. And a complaint I often hear is right after the thing gets published, they learn so much more that should have been published in the book. Are you getting letters or feedback from folks who have more stuff?
A little bit, yeah. The book just came out, yeah, on Tuesday, so it's I'm waiting for the deluge, but I had posted about it on Instagram, and there had been a reporter who had actually done a profile for of the ELF for the New Yorker back in 2005, 2006. He'd worked like 6 months. He'd gotten all these interviews, and the New Yorker ended up killing it. And I got this email from him where he just said like, "Oh man, if you'd reached out to me, I would have given you, this huge stack of tapes and notebooks that's been sitting on in my drawers for years." And so there's archival material out there. There's stuff that I'm sure is filling in holes that I sort of knew when I was writing it that needed patching. There's also an enormous amount of FBI documents about their involvement in um, infiltrating radical environmental movements that is not out there yet. There were sort of two major cases, and major cases are a very rare thing in the Bureau. They only happen, a handful of times a year. But there were two major ones that they launched into environmentalism, one after 9/11, another one slightly before. And there are almost no documents from that have been brought out through FOIA. They're sitting somewhere, and I'm so curious what's in there. So there are definitely questions to be answered and a sort of fuller history to be offered.
Now, I have one more question, I believe, before I read some of the audience questions. I just want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, to pop it in the chat box. But I am going to press you a little bit to do some of the synthesis that the folks were wanting you to do. Because I do think, what it is important to ask you, what does the ELF, mean? What is their importance in our current conversation around how we live on this planet, how we deal with climate change, and how we build the world that we want?
I think I mean, I'll answer in that one of the sort of position I got to around sabotage as a tactic is it required sort of looking at other historical examples. What I came to was sometimes it really works. I mean, the anti-apartheid movement used sabotage. Nelson Mandela conducted a very ELF-like campaign of burning down government buildings that were, again, unoccupied. And he gave a very eloquent address in the dock on Robbins Island talking about why he did this, and it was an important part of the movement. The civil rights movement, as the Elizabeth Hinton's recent history outlines, there were thousands of fires. They weren't organized in quite the same way that the ELF did, but a lot of buildings burned down. And there was that the fact that there were riots, the fact that things got there was a particular type of damage that was inflicted, weighed on lawmakers' minds. Lyndon Johnson thought about this. The suffragettes broke windows. I think in all of those cases, again, it was a situation where there was a radical flank that was connected to a legible, active political movement that was asking for very specific, clear legislative things. I think when the ELF absolutely did not have that. They were not in dialogue with a political movement that was pushing for things that the ELF's actions could contribute to. And they were really sort of out on their lonesome. And I think that was a real mistake. And I think that was part of the reason why these kind of grandiose aspirations they had were just too grandiose. There were not 1,000. I think at one point they sort of hoped that it would spark, that 1 million ELF cells would bloom, and that would sort of put some kind of extrajudicial force on industry, and that just didn't happen. So I think that the lesson I got from this is that if you're going to pursue politics through criminal, unconventional means, it has to be welded to a conventional politics as well. I think that's the kind of like, again, kind of dry academic lesson I drew from this.
Well, yeah, you one more thing that you did just bring to mind, just the title, the photograph. You mentioned Liz's book, which is America on Fire. There is something
Terrific book.
particularly politically potent about seeing, these sort of symbols on fire. And that seems to keep coming back in vogue among groups that want to change things.
I should say, I mean, fire is a very potent weapon of the weak. I mean, it's something that does a lot of destructive damage very cheaply. So it's something that is not going to, as a tool for political change, I don't think it's going to go out of favor anytime soon. But yes, there is also this like spectacular symbolic component of it. It's something where it's sabotage, but it also is its own advertising. Like there was an awareness on the part of the ELF that if you set something on fire, people will point cameras at that and people will have strong feelings about that. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there when we have images of things on fire, we respond just viscerally to it. And so I absolutely agree that that is something that political movements keep discovering whether they decide to use them or use that as a tactic or not.
Let's see. I do have one audience question from Olivia, who asks, the tactic of having an extremist fringe to make other factions seem more moderate is something that's clearly in effect among environmental activists today. But did you find any other wide-scale tactics that have been passed down through the generations as well?
It's a great question. Thank you, Olivia. I mean, yeah, you do see certain elements in particularly the climate movement that I think very consciously are adopting something more radical. But yeah, in terms of tactics that have been passed down through movements, I mean, sort of a lot of things. I mean, there was a radical environmentalists, I think, were very careful about thinking about organizing or thinking about how you apply civil disobedience. I think thinking about uh, pretty carefully about where you make inroads with more mainstream people pushing for similar ends. At its best, the radical environmentalism movement and the mainstream environmentalism movement had a kind of uneasy simpatico where they were both, the Earth First really did sort of, for all their extremity, really kept an eye on what ha was happening in Washington. We're really focused on particular pieces of legislation. And so I think that in some ways, they were a more conventional, they acted at moments like a very conventional political movement and tried to draw um, lessons and tactics from that, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of tactics have been passed down and one of the things I learned was that, the degree to which people who are work in political movements now, anarchists actually, very much among them, are big readers and really try and sort of think about what people have been doing before. So in some ways, in writing this book, I was hoping it would be a constitutive part of that, or that it would be in terms of reminding people of the ELF. It would bring that back into the conversation to a particular degree, or it would serve as some kind of lesson from which people could, or to could change how they do their own work. Yeah, a fantastic question.
Well, a follow-up from me, this book is a real reminder that the window of discourse has widened, especially when it comes to the environment. The things that would have been going on at Evergreen, which is, a very left of center educational institution. Now that's, your standard environmental studies program at a state school.
That's a great point. I mean, in terms of both, I mean, kind of what people are learning. I mean, I grew up in a very West Coast liberal household, Marin County, California. We learned about, saving the rainforest. We learned about the importance of recycling. But now when I, talk with friends who have kids in school, I mean, it's much more about environmental justice. It's a much more kind of holistic view of, you have people you have children of a very young age learning about fossil fuel infrastructure. I mean, it's something you're absolutely right. I mean, there's been things that can start as, particularly in academia, as radical, can very quickly become disseminated to non-radical institutions. I think that's absolutely true. And I think in terms of tactics, that can also happen. Things that are there's a much wider window of political possibility right now, even if there's a more aggressive security state around it.
Well, I also would like to know though, for the former ELF folks, I do think a lot about the phenomenon of elite capture. So the way that, radicalism becomes part of the language of academia and politics, but not actually part of the politic. And you've got professors now writing about blowing up pipelines. You have a widening of the discourse, but I imagine there are some feelings within the veterans of the movement about the actual proclivities and actions of those folks.
Totally. I mean, I went through a doctoral program in sociology. I'm very aware that there is a real difference between theory and praxis, and that you get tenure for theory, not praxis. I mean, I think that there is, most people in academia when it comes down to it, are Elizabeth Warren Democrats. I mean, it's not something where they are, um, I think, pushing politically for stuff that's super extreme. So I think there is, at the same time, again, I mean, the ELF read academic histories. I mean, people in the movement read this stuff. So even if I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even if there is a deep degree of elite capture, that stuff can filter out, and I think it can be helpful for people who are very much in the praxis side of things.
We've got an audience question from Clint. How many people were ultimately arrested or went to prison, and for how long? And can you give an example of how one or some of the trials went?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I mean, the so ultimately 16 ELF defendants were arrested. And when they were arrested, they all had to make just a kind of horrific choice about, as is true of most federal prosecutions, do you cooperate with the federal government and name names and say who you were working with and testify against other people, or do you risk a much longer sentence by not cooperating? And a number of ELF defendants chose to not cooperate, but most of them ultimately did. And that mitigated sentences a little bit. I think the longest sentence that was handed out was 13 years. A number of them got, I think, 10, 8 significant sentences for property destruction, especially given that a few years before, Jeff Lewis, an environmental activist in Eugene, had been given a 22-year sentence for the symbolic destruction of a single SUV. I think it maybe burned a few others that were around it a little bit. But he was protesting climate change, and he said, "I'm going to set one SUV on fire as a way of, broadcasting that, and they absolutely threw the book at him. So you see this actually, I mean, recently with the Prairie Land defendants, a situation where it seems there's a real intent to send a warning to activists about being involved in particular type of dissent. So regarding the actual trials, there were very few trials for the ELF. There were sentencings, and again, people I think tried to argue that what they'd done for good reasons, and that sometimes that was didn't seem to be particularly effective with the judge.
Another question from Brian, and you just touched on this, but what role did education play in the ELF story? You know, did any academics join ELF?
That's a terrific question. I mean, so excuse me, a few of the most of the ELF defendants were college educated. They were a couple of them were had attended Evergreen State, which had been a absolutely source of radicalism. I think the wider story, I mean, some of them obviously took environmental education classes, but this was, the mid 90s. The curriculum was not quite what it was now. I think what was most interesting was that Eugene, Oregon itself was where um, uh, University of Oregon is headquartered, and that has a deep history of radicalism going back to the 1960s. At one point, I think during the Vietnam War, local students firebombed an armory that was doing drafting for the war. So it was a situation where I think there was a kind of ambient radicalism around that. And Eugene was interesting because it was also a logging community. So radical environmentalism happened there in part because it was this history of radicalism that just came crashing into capitalism, where there were these fights about logging. But so I think in terms of but I should also say Avalon, you mentioned William Rogers was himself an occasional professor at Prescott State College. So, and a lot of his readings that he would give out and hand out to people, influence people, came from academia. So I think there's no, it played I think in a number of different ways, a very important role in the movement and in the ELF in particular.
And I think we have one more. After all this reporting, did your own sense of what justifies violence shift in any way?
That's again a great question. I mean, I think violence is also a little bit of a tricky term. I think it was funny. I mean, I wrote this thing in a lot of this I drafted in Los Angeles where I was out for another reporting project. And I spent, a few months in Los Angeles in Hollywood foothills just kind of banging out this draft. And I went home, and 2 weeks later, the LA fires started. And it's very hard to not sort of put those two things in dialogue with each other, where the FBI moves heaven and earth to catch people who burn down maybe a couple dozen buildings at most. And then there's this just inferno that sweeps through Southern California and kills a number of people and incinerates thousands of buildings. And I don't know if it changed my understanding of exactly when violence works, but it definitely put it into proportion for me in sort of moral terms, or it made me think differently about what it means to set a single building on fire. The cost of that, I think, seemed somehow less given the kind of scale of the catastrophe that they were trying to forfend.
And I believe that's all of our audience questions, and I think we are at time. Matthew, thank you
Van,
for spending a wonderful lunch hour with me and with us.
thank you so much for hosting this. Thank you for so many thoughtful questions, and thank you to the audience and to New America. This has been a pleasure.
All right.